The first sound was not the scream itself, but the silence that came before it. Kentucky, autumn of 1873. When the hollows ran red with rust water and the fog never lifted, not even under noon sun, travelers whispered of a family in these mountains, a family whose name locals spoke the way a priest speaks the devil's, Sinclair. If you've never heard of them, that's no accident. Their story was never meant for daylight. You were never supposed to hear what I'm about to tell you. Phineas Webb wasn't the first to vanish in Hollingsworth Hollow, but his case was the one that cracked open the coffin lid. His backpack was found first, torn fabric tangled in briars, like prayer flags in a church abandoned by God. A compass inside spun wildly, as though true north itself had fled these mountains. His journal was worse. Words scratched in frantic hand about voices in the fog, smoke where no fire should be, and a hunger that seemed to move through the forest itself. The final entry wasn't his. Forensic analysis confirmed it. Someone else had picked up his pen. They've been so kind to take me in. The meat here tastes like nothing I've ever had. Understand this. What I'm about to reveal isn't folklore. It isn't ghost stories told by firelight. It's a pattern stretching across generations, disappearances, erased records, lawmen who learned to look away. The Sinclairs were not killers in the way newspapers like to label monsters. No. They were something older, something colder. They were survival refined into ritual, hospitality sharpened into a blade, hunger transformed into a system. This is why the Appalachian forests still hold silence in their bones, because every missing hiker, every lost hunter, every body never recovered, becomes part of a lineage of secrecy too dangerous to name. But tonight, you're going to hear it, and once you do, you won't see the mountains the same way again. You've already stepped into the hollow. There's no turning back. The first settlers who stumbled into Hollingsworth Hollow learned quickly that this was not land meant for man. The Cherokee avoided it entirely, calling it where the earth eats, a place where sound warped and the soil refused to give up its dead. But when Irving Sinclair came here in the early 1800s, he saw not a curse, but an opportunity. He was not like other men who pushed westward chasing fertile soil or timber. Sinclair chased silence, secrecy, and the kind of isolation that allowed a man to bend the rules of God and man without interference. He came with Florence, a midwife whispered to practice arts beyond medicine, a woman who could bring a child into this world or send a soul out of it with the same calm hands. Together they built a homestead where no one dared settle, and what they cultivated was not crops, not livestock, but a method of survival that twisted neighborly hospitality into predation. Think about this. In a time when settlers were starving, when winters stripped flesh from bone and children died before their first birthday, the Sinclair family thrived. Their smokehouse never emptied. Their children grew tall and strong, while nearby families buried theirs in shallow mountain graves. Neighbors noticed, but neighbors also feared. And in Appalachia, fear breeds silence faster than bullets. When travelers came through, deserters from the war, drifters, peddlers who left no roots, the Sinclair cabin opened its door. Warm stew, a smile, a place by the fire. And then, the trail went cold, always cold. Names carved into a beam in their cabin still remain, not as guests welcomed, but as sacrifices consumed. And here's the truth no one wanted written. The Sinclairs did not simply kill to survive. They learned to savor, to refine. They learned that human flesh preserved, seasoned, and smoked could last through the deepest winter without rot, could keep a family alive when livestock starved. Over generations, this was no longer survival. It became ritual. It became identity. And by 1873, when disappearances clustered around Hollingsworth Hollow like flies on meat, Local sheriffs had already learned the bargain. Look away, accept the quiet gifts left on their desks, and live to see spring. You must understand, what appears as brutality from the outside to the Sinclair bloodline was tradition. It was inheritance. It was a covenant with hunger itself. And once a family learns to feed on travelers, there is no returning to farming, no return to God's order, no turning back. By the autumn of 1873, the Sinclair name was less a family and more a shadow that stretched across the Appalachian ridgeline, whispered at trading posts and saloons, but never spoken too loudly, because men understood that some words carried a price. That year was marked not just by hunger, but by war's long aftertaste, as deserters still roamed the hills, Union and Confederate alike, men hollowed out by bloodshed and desperate for shelter. It was one such deserter, Josiah Stanhope, who stumbled into Hollingsworth Hollow and left behind the journal that revealed the family's truest face. His entries begin with gratitude, describing a feast that seemed impossible in the lean mountain winter. Tender meat, rich herbs, and a hospitality so generous it drew tears. But over days, the handwriting unravels. Words scratched with the panic of a man who realizes too late he has wandered into the arms of something older than law. He writes of the trails being blocked, of the family insisting wild animals stalked the woods. Though he saw no tracks, no scat, only watchful eyes from the porch, counting each of his movements as though he had already ceased being a guest and had become a harvest waiting ripening. The meat, he notes, begins to taste familiar. That word, carved into his journal like a blade dragged across skin, is the crack in the mask. And when his script devolves into jagged slashes, one line survives: I cannot leave. No one knows how long he lasted after that final scrawl. But what matters is not his death. What matters is how his death folded neatly into a pattern that had already existed for decades. Disappearances aligned with the family's cycles, always in late autumn and early spring, when outsiders drifted through the mountains and could be plucked without drawing too much attention. Lawmen who investigated too far often received a quiet package left at their doors, jars of meat, salted and smoked, perfectly prepared, no label to identify its origin, but unmistakable in implication. A warning and a bribe, a message that said, you can eat or you can vanish. And in a land where most families fought the cold with empty cupboards, no sheriff wanted to ask what animal had fed him that night. By 1873, the Sinclairs had become untouchable, not because they hid well, but because they had woven themselves into the psychology of the mountains. Fear protected them more than bullets ever could. What separates brutality from ritual is intention, and by the late 1800s, the Sinclairs had crossed that threshold with precision, transforming hunger into a kind of theology, one passed down not through scripture, but through practice, whispers, and the blood-stained lessons of family supper. In Hollingsworth Hollow, food was never just food. It was memory. It was loyalty. It was control. The elders taught the young not merely how to butcher, but how to look into the eyes of a stranger and see more than flesh, to see resource, to see inheritance, to see the continuation of a covenant no outsider could comprehend. Imagine sitting at that long pine table in the cabin, the fire throwing shadows across rough-hewn walls, the smell of smoke and rosemary and iron heavy in the air, and being told that the stew in your bowl carried with it not just sustenance but history, that to eat was to become Sinclair, to tie yourself forever to the mountain's hunger. They called it keeping the line fed, a phrase that meant more than survival. It meant obedience. It meant silence. It meant that to betray the secret was to sever yourself from blood itself. Guests were not always taken immediately. Sometimes they were watched, tested, measured for strength or usefulness before the inevitable. The Sinclairs learned patience the way a hunter learns the patterns of deer, knowing when to strike, when to wait, when to let the quarry believe it had escaped. This patience was their weapon, and it bled into every interaction so that neighbors saw them as harmless, even generous, never realizing that their kindness was the bait in the trap. Over time, the rituals deepened, prayers whispered over smoking racks, names carved not only into beams, but into bone. The marrow boiled down for broth that only family was allowed to drink, sealing loyalty with every swallow. They did not see themselves as darers, but as keepers of balance. In their eyes, the outsiders who wandered too far into the hollow had broken an unspoken pact with the land, and payment was required. To those who lived beyond the ridges, the Sinclairs were rumors, half-believed warnings told to children to keep them close to home. But inside the hollow, they were something else entirely. A dynasty fed by secrecy, bound by appetite, hardened into a faith where hunger itself was God, and feeding that God was both duty and privilege. The most chilling truth is that the Sinclairs were never truly alone in their crimes. The mountains themselves shielded them, and the people who lived within shouting distance of Hollingsworth Hollow learned quickly that survival often meant complicity. Neighbors who suspected too much were rewarded with gifts no struggling homestead could refuse: jars of salted meat, bundles of herbs, tools and pelts that appeared mysteriously on porches after a disappearance, tokens of mountain hospitality that made mouths water and suspicions soften. Lawmen, too, received their offerings, not as overt bribes, but as subtle reminders of what silence could earn them. A deputy's widow given food enough to last a winter, a sheriff's son invited to hunt deer with Sinclair boys, and returning with venison so tender he dared not question its source. This was how the family grew untouchable, not through brute force, but through a careful weaving of favors and fears, a network of unspoken bargains that turned the hollow into a sanctuary of secrets. And the children, raised within this structure, were taught early that their very survival depended on discretion. A Sinclair child's first lesson was not in prayer or schooling, but in silence. Never speak of what you eat. Never describe what happens after the fire dies low. Never name the guest once the trail goes cold. They grew up playing among bones buried in shallow pits, never distinguishing deer from man, because for them the two had blurred into the same category: game taken from the mountain. In their minds there was no crime, only continuity, only the honoring of a pact their ancestors had sealed in blood and hunger. That conditioning bred a loyalty sharper than steel. A Sinclair child who dared question the ritual was not scolded, but shown the smokehouse, shown the racks, shown the truth that outsiders were temporary and fey. Millie was eternal. In that indoctrination, fear and devotion fused, leaving no space for rebellion. And so the cycle tightened with each generation, until by 1873 the hollow itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the family's hunger, the fog rising and falling like a chest, inhaling secrets too heavy for daylight. Outsiders saw only a poor mountain clan scraping by, but those who lived closest knew better, and they chose silence, because in Appalachia, silence is a kind of currency, and speaking too loudly about the Sinclairs was a debt no man wanted to pay. The first man who ever dared to pierce the veil of Sinclair secrecy came not with a gun, but with a Bible, and his fate was sealed the moment his boots touched the mud of Hollingsworth Hollow. Reverend Corbin rode in during the spring of 1873, carrying with him the conviction that no darkness could resist the light of Scripture, no family was beyond redemption. He had heard whispers from parishioners too frightened to name their fears outright, stories of travelers vanishing, of suppers that left neighbors uneasy, of a smokehouse that seemed to burn long after the livestock was gone. Corbin believed in cleansing, in dragging sin into daylight, but he did not understand that in the hollow daylight itself bent to the will of the Sinclairs. They welcomed him with open arms, Florence Sinclair setting a place at her table as if she had been waiting for him, her eyes bright with something between mockery and hospitality. Corbin preached over supper, quoting verses about gluttony, sacrifice, the wages of sin, while the family listened politely, nodding, even bowing their heads in prayer. But in the hollow, words meant nothing without action. And when Corbin laid his Bible on the table, declaring he would return the next Sunday with townsfolk to hold service on Sinclair land, the family exchanged a glance that sealed his fate. He did not return the following week. In fact, no one saw him again beyond the hollow, and when search parties ventured close, they found only his horse tethered to a cedar tree, its saddle stripped bare, its eyes wide as though it had witnessed something that unmoored its animal mind. Corbin's disappearance was written off as another victim of wild terrain, another man swallowed by the mountain's indifference, but in truth his sermon never left the Sinclair table. For years afterward, Florence was said to recite his verses in mocking tones as Samuel. He stirred her stews, a reminder that even God's messengers could be broken down to bone and broth when they forgot whose dominion they trespassed upon. His Bible, pages stained and warped, was rumored to have been repurposed as kindling for the smokehouse fire that season, each verse curling into ash that flavored the air of Hollingsworth Hollow with a scripture of hunger no pulpit would ever recognize. And in that ash lay the lesson carved into every Sinclair child. No law, no church, no state could claim dominion here. The hollow belonged to hunger, and hunger always won. By the time Reverend Corbin's disappearance faded into rumor, the Sinclairs had perfected their craft, no longer waiting for fate to deliver prey, but actively weaving their own snares from the most disarming tools a mountain family could wield: kindness, warmth, and the promise of shelter. Hospitality became their camouflage, and their mastery of it was almost artful. A weary traveler might stumble across a Sinclair child tending goats by the creek, or a woman hanging laundry from a line strung between cabins, each encounter engineered to feel accidental, each gesture calculated to soften suspicion. "You look cold," they would say, offering coffee steaming with herbs that dulled the senses. "Stay the night. You'll be safer here than wandering alone." The cabins themselves reinforced the illusion: clean quilts on the bed, jars of preserves lined neatly in the cellar, a hearth crackling with warmth. To a drifter half-starved, to a soldier lost on the run, it was a glimpse of Eden in the wilderness. And yet beneath this veneer, every Sinclair eye tracked movements with the patience of predators. Every smile weighed the value of the guest, not as neighbor, but as sustenance. They learned to test their quarry gently at first, asking where the traveler came from, who might be waiting for him, how long before anyone noticed if he didn't return. A wrong answer, a hint of isolation, a suggestion that no one would come searching. That was the moment when the guest's fate was sealed, though he would never know it. Supper would be served, laughter shared, even songs sung around the fire, but always with the same inevitable conclusion. By morning, the trail of the traveler would end where Sinclair land began, and the hollow would once again tighten its grip on secrets too heavy to leave. This method made them untouchable because it aligned with human instinct. Who questions kind? Ness, who rejects hospitality in a land so harsh. The Sinclairs weaponized what others revered, turning generosity into a lure, warmth into a trap, love into the coldest form of consumption. And in time, even neighbors who suspected the truth stopped resisting it, because in Appalachia, survival is not about morality, it is about adaptation. And no one adapted more ruthlessly than the Sinclairs of Hollingsworth Hollow. For the Sinclair children, growing up in Hollingsworth Hollow meant learning a curriculum no schoolhouse could ever sanction, a pedagogy written not in books, but in the marrow of those who came before. From their earliest days, they were taught that outsiders were not people in the same way family was people. Outsiders were transient, like passing storms or migrating animals, useful only in what they could provide before disappearing back into the wilderness or into the smokehouse. The first lessons came not with words, but with sight and smell. A child asked to stir a pot, and told to memorize the difference between venison and the darker flesh that slipped into the stew with almost no distinction, save for a sweetness on the tongue that they were told was the taste of the line. They learned to smile when greeting strangers, to make their eyes soft and their hands open, because trust was the bait and innocence was the hook. Older kin would stage rehearsals pretending to be travelers, forcing the children to practice questions with casual curiosity. Where you from? Who waits for you? How long you plan to stay? Every answer was catalogued, weighed, and if the guest met the criteria of isolation, the children were instructed to memorize their face, their voice, their weaknesses, because every detail mattered when feeding the line. Punishment for hesitation was not a beating, but something far worse: exclusion from the meal. To be denied supper was to be reminded that family unity and survival were one and the same, that silence and obedience were not negotiable virtues, but the very price of life itself. Over time, these children grew into adults who could wear masks better than any actor, their gentleness so convincing that even seasoned hunters or weary deserters found themselves lulled into trust. Yet beneath that practiced warmth was a coldness older than the soil they stood on, the understanding that their lineage was both burden and privilege, that to hesitate in the ritual was to betray blood, and betrayal was unthinkable. By adolescence, a Sinclair child could gut a deer or a man with equal efficiency, never flinching, never trembling, because they had been taught from the cradle that hunger was God, and feeding that God was their inheritance. In that hollow, childhood ended early, and what replaced it was something colder than adulthood. It was indoctrination carved into bone, a loyalty so absolute it killed the possibility of doubt before doubt could ever be born. By the close of the 19th century, whispers of Hollingsworth Hollow had already begun to seep beyond the ridgelines, carried on the tongues of traders, drifters, and the rare survivor who staggered out pale and broken, unwilling to put into words what they had seen or heard among the Sinclairs. In towns along the Kentucky border, stories morphed into folklore, tales of the hollow that eats men, of strange lights flickering in the fog, of voices singing when no singers were there. Parents used the hollow as a threat to keep children close, warning that if they wandered too far, the family in the fog would claim them. Hunters swapped tales in saloons about deer that bled black, or about screams that started strong and then choked off too quickly, as if the mountains themselves had swallowed them whole. These legends served the Sinclairs better than secrecy ever could, because superstition became their shield. People dismissed the missing as victims of curses, ghosts, or wild animals rather than human design, and the hollow itself grew into a kind of mythic no-man's land, a place respectable folk avoided, leaving only the desperate, the reckless, and the rootless to wander in. Those were the perfect victims, and the family knew it. What outsiders saw as warning signs, the mist that never lifted, the creek that ran rust-brown, the way sound died suddenly between the trees, the Sinclairs saw as camouflage, a natural stage upon which their rituals could play out without interruption. And so the folklore thickened like fog, stories growing more grotesque with every telling: cannibal witches, skinwalkers, blood-drinking spirits. But the truth was far colder than myth, because the family behind the stories were flesh and blood, practical in their cruelty, systematic in their methods. Ghosts do not bait you with kindness, nor do curses ask about your kin before you vanish. Only human beings can extend a hand with warmth while already measuring where to carve when the fire burns low. That duality, that mask of hospitality, is why the Sinclair story endured, because the hollow did not need to haunt with spirits. It haunted with smiles, with laughter, with quilts spread neatly on a bed that no guest would ever rise from again. And though the world outside Appalachia changed, railroads, telegraphs, towns growing fat on industry, Hollingsworth Hollow remained a pocket of silence, a wound that never closed, a place where folklore and flesh fed on each other until no man could tell story from truth, except those who never came back to speak at all. It was only a matter of time before the growing web of disappearances, whispered rumors, and half-mad testimonies reached ears beyond the ridges, and when it did, the first true outsiders came not with scripture or suspicion, but with badges and authority. In the winter of 1891, 2 federal investigators, dispatched from Lexington under pressure from families demanding answers, rode into the mountains armed with warrants and certainty, convinced that their modern law could tame whatever primitive violence lingered in the backwoods. They were strangers to the hollow, men of pressed coats and polished boots, unused to the shifting fog that swallowed sound, to the narrow trails that bent back on themselves like a maze designed by something older than men. Their questions rattled through nearby towns like stones dropped into a pond, stirring unease but little cooperation. Those who knew better lowered their eyes, muttering that the hollow had its own justice and that no good would come from stirring it. Still, the investigators pressed on, their notebooks filling with names, times, and patterns of the missing, their certainty hardening with every interview that ended in silence. When they finally reached Sinclair land, they found cabins warm, fires glowing, children laughing in the yard, a picture of domesticity so perfect it mocked their suspicions. The family welcomed them as honored guests, offering food, lodging, and smiles that seemed to gleam just a little too long in the lamplight. For 3 days, the investigators stayed, taking meals at the family's table, scribbling in their notebooks by candlelight, never realizing that every question they asked was answered with a question in return. Every note they wrote was being weighed. Every glance exchanged between the Sinclairs was a silent conversation about timing. On the 4th day, one notebook was found miles away, in a creek bed, pages warped with water, its final words smudged but legible enough to chill anyone who read them. They are not what they seem. Neither man was seen again, and no report ever left the hollow. Officially, they vanished in the wilderness, another casualty of treacherous terrain, their names added to the long roll of the lost. Unofficially, in taverns and on porches, people whispered that the hollow had swallowed the law itself, that even the reach of Washington ended at its foggy border. The Sinclairs, emboldened by the failure of authority, grew only more confident, their grip tightening until it seemed the mountain itself bent to their will, feeding the legend that Hollingsworth Hollow was not merely a place on a map, but a hunger that consumed anyone foolish enough to believe they could master it. As the 20th century crept over the ridgelines with its railroads, wars, and industrial noise, the world beyond Appalachia seemed to forget the Sinclairs, as though they had been swallowed not just by the mountains, but by history itself, erased by the sheer weight of progress. New factories belched smoke into the sky, young men marched off to foreign battlefields, cities pulsed with electricity, and the hollow became an afterthought, a ghost on the edge of maps no one bothered to redraw. Officials who once promised inquiries let their attention drift to mines, mills, and revenue, while newspapers that had briefly flirted with tales of vanished travelers shifted focus to national headlines, treating the hollow like a superstition unworthy of ink. In truth, this forgetfulness was its own form of protection for the Sinclairs, a cloak woven by the indifference of a nation too busy expanding outward to care about what secrets festered in its forgotten corners. Generations within the hollow understood this shift instinctively and leaned into it, their rituals continuing in silence, their methods passed down like heirlooms, unchanged, unchallenged. Outsiders still vanished, of course, but their disappearances blended seamlessly into the broader chaos of the age. A soldier on furlough who never made it back to base, a prospector who set out with tools and never returned, a peddler whose cart was found abandoned on a road no one claimed to travel. Each was written off as another casualty of rugged life, swallowed by accident, war, or poverty, and so the hollow tightened its shroud of obscurity. By mid-century, the Sinclair name was more folktale than fact. their legacy existing only in the tremor of a grandmother's warning or the sidelong glance of a hunter who refused to track deer too far into the fog. To outsiders, the hollow was a myth, a story told by the fire to keep children from wandering, but to those within its reach, it remained a living truth, a place where smiles could still hide blades, where hospitality could still be fatal, and where time itself seemed to bend around hunger's will. And so, while the rest of America raced toward modernity, Hollingsworth Hollow stood unchanged, an untouched wound, a silence too deep for history books to hold, waiting with the patience of stone for the next unwary soul to stumble into its grasp. The Great Depression, and, soon after, the chaos of World War II, breathed new life into the legend of Hollingsworth Hollow. For once again, the mountains filled with the kind of men the Sinclairs had always known how to claim, the rootless, the broken, the desperate. During the Depression, hollow-eyed wanderers drifted along back roads in search of food or work, many carrying only a bindle and hope thin as paper. And when the hollow's mist curled around them, it was not warning they saw, but refuge, the promise of a hot meal, a barn to sleep in, a family that smiled without asking coin. For those men, the hollow was a mercy, until it was not. Then came the war, and with it deserters and draft dodgers who slipped into the Appalachians to vanish from the reach of Uncle Sam, believing the deep woods their salvation. Some were said to have stumbled into Sinclair cabins, where their uniforms were taken, their dog tags tossed into the river, and their bones eventually buried under the same soil that had hidden countless before them. By then, the hollow's name had become a campfire constant. Soldiers on leave would whisper about the place in the hills where you don't come back, while children dared each other to walk 3 steps into the fog and call for the family by name. Yet, even as the outside world roared with tanks, bombs, and factories, the Sinclairs remained unchanged, their rituals immune to modernity. Radios brought jazz and war bulletins into the mountains, but no wire carried news out of the hollow. Electricity lit up towns, but the hollow's cabins still glowed with lantern light, timeless and still. Outsiders might vanish more quietly amid the upheaval of war, their absence written off as desertion or vagrancy, but for the Sinclairs, it was business as usual. Their line preserved, their hunger fed, their story darkening into one more layer of folklore that outsiders called myth, even as bones piled unseen beneath the earth. The hollow had always thrived on the forgotten, and in an era when forgetting was easier than asking, the Sinclairs perfected their silence, feeding off a world too distracted to notice the mountain shadows watching from behind their smiles. By the 1950s and 60s, when America was laying down highways like veins across the land and selling the dream of mobility to anyone with a car and a few dollars for gas, the hollow once again found itself fed by forces beyond its borders. Tourists chasing the romance of the Appalachian Trail, young couples eager to picnic in secluded clearings, and city men hunting cheap thrills in forgotten towns, all found their way to roads that narrowed and twisted until the map itself grew uncertain, until the asphalt gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way to fog. Progress, in its arrogance, had pushed closer to the hollow without ever realizing that some places are not meant to be connected, and so the Sinclairs adapted, their old methods of luring wanderers folding neatly into the new age. Where once they had relied on lost trappers and lone peddlers, they now preyed on travelers whose cars broke down at just the wrong stretch of road, or hikers who accepted an offer of water from smiling children before realizing they had strayed miles from the trailhead. The family learned to speak the language of tourists, to ask casual questions about destinations and itineraries, always weighing whether anyone was expecting them soon. If the answer was no, the hollow became their final stop. Missing persons bulletins began to creep into nearby counties. A college couple whose last known photo showed them posing with backpacks on a ridge. A salesman whose car was found stripped clean beside a creek. A family whose camping gear was scattered across the woods, but whose bodies never turned up. Authorities searched, but the hollow always seemed to bend around their efforts. Fog swallowing search parties, trails leading nowhere, locals muttering that the mountains did not give up what they took. The legend deepened with each vanished tourist, campfire stories now colliding with modern headlines. And yet the Sinclairs remained ghosts to those who hunted them, their cabins tucked away in valleys untouched by roads, their smiles still sharp enough to pass as kindness. Even as television beamed images of a country hurtling toward the future, Hollingsworth Hollow clung to its timelessness, its appetite untouched, feeding quietly on the very modernity that brought strangers closer to its mist. The 1970s brought with them a new kind of wanderer, not the desperate laborers or fleeing soldiers of decades past, but seekers. Hitchhikers with guitars slung across their backs, drifters chasing communes and cheap thrills, runaways who believed the road itself could be home. And for the hollow, they were an unexpected gift. The highways carried them farther, the back roads funneled them in, and the Sinclairs found their prey disguised in tie-dye and denim, speaking of peace and freedom, while unknowingly stepping into a place where neither had ever existed. Hippies hiking through the Appalachians in search of transcendence vanished into fog that swallowed their laughter. Hitchhikers who accepted a ride from an old Sinclair truck never saw the road again. Young women who stopped to sketch wildflowers on the trail were later spoken of only in rumors, their journals or beads turning up far from where they should have been. Authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer number of disappearances nationwide in that restless decade, filed most away as runaways, overdoses, or cult casualties, and in doing so gave the Sinclairs cover finer than fog. The family adapted effortlessly, their children taught to offer weed or whiskey as bait instead of bread and milk, to speak the language of freedom while quietly leading strangers deeper into the hollow. Campfire tales in nearby towns shifted again, no longer about witches and cannibals alone, but about a place where the counterculture simply vanished, where songs stopped in the middle of verses, where love beads were found strung on tree branches like warnings. Some locals swore the Sinclairs had grown bold enough to host travelers for entire weekends, offering music, drink, and false friendship before extinguishing it all in the cold ritual that bound their bloodline. To outsiders, these stories blurred into the era's broader paranoia. Cults, serial killers, conspiracies. But to those who knew the hollow, it was just the same hunger wearing new clothes. And so, even as America marched into modernity, its youth searching for freedom in every corner, Hollingsworth Hollow remained the same silent trap it had always been. A place where hope, rebellion, and wanderlust ended in silence beneath ancient trees. By the 1980s, as America grew obsessed with sensational crimes, satanic cult panics, and the rise of televised true crime, Hollingsworth Hollow briefly resurfaced from its long obscurity, whispered again, not just in mountain towns, but on late-night radio shows and in the pages of lurid tabloids. Hikers went missing in record numbers that decade, their stories magnified by the media's hunger for the bizarre, and the hollow's name crept back into headlines, though always blurred with rumor, presented as half-truth or campfire legend repackaged for suburban audiences. Amateur ghost hunters drove deep into Appalachia chasing whispers of witch covens, while teenagers dared each other to camp near the ridgeline, filming shaky VHS tapes in the fog. Some of those tapes were found abandoned in the woods, the final frames dissolving into static as if swallowed by silence itself. Law enforcement, fueled by the era's paranoia about cults, did mount fresh investigations after several well-publicized disappearances. A trio of college students whose station wagon was found neatly parked at the edge of a dirt road, a seasoned outdoorsman whose maps and compass were recovered near the hollow's border, and a family of 4 whose campsite looked undisturbed, save for the eerie absence of bodies. Yet, as had always been the case, the hollow seemed to mock their efforts. Bloodhounds lost the scent. Search parties circled back to their starting point, radios cut to dead air without warning. Locals muttered that the government was looking in the wrong direction, that no satanic cult was at work, only the same family who had always been there, watching, smiling, feeding. But officials, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that such darkness could belong to flesh-and-blood neighbors, filed their reports under accidents, animal attacks, or unknown causes, and the hollow slipped back into the Mars. Jinns. To the outside world, it became a fleeting curiosity, lumped alongside urban legends like the Jersey Devil or the Mothman. But for those who lived in its shadow, the Sinclairs were never myth. They were simply patient, their rituals undisturbed by cameras, radios, or investigators. And so the 1980s came and went, leaving behind little more than static-filled tapes, yellowed clippings, and whispers on CB radios, fragments of a truth too old, too entrenched, and too human to ever fade completely. The 1990s carried Hollingsworth Hollow into an unexpected new chapter, not through the mouths of mountain folk or the columns of small-town papers, but through the strange, uncharted frontier of the Internet, where rumors that once died in taverns or at campfires now spread across message boards and chat rooms like wildfire. Early paranormal forums buzzed with anonymous posts about the family in the fog, grainy scanned photographs of old cabins and moss-covered gravestones passed around as supposed proof, and long, rambling threads where users claimed to know someone who had ventured into the hollow and never returned. College students swapped stories of eerie road trips into the Appalachians, their accounts typed out in all-caps confessions that blurred fact and fiction until both felt inseparable. Local newspapers, digitized for the first time, gave eager readers access to decades-old clippings about vanished hikers and missing families, fueling a new generation of armchair investigators who tried to connect the disappearances into a single, sinister pattern. For the first time, the Hollow's legend reached far beyond Appalachia, landing in dorm rooms in California, basements in New Jersey, even across oceans, its myth reborn in the sterile glow of computer screens. Yet as the story expanded, it also grew distorted. Some claimed the Sinclairs were a blood cult, others insisted they were inbred cannibals, while fringe theorists suggested the hollow was a supernatural vortex swallowing travelers whole. The Sinclairs themselves, if they noticed at all, seemed untouched by this new attention, their world still lit by lanterns, their rituals carried out beneath the same canopy of trees that had hidden their line for generations. And though the Internet churned with speculation, the reality on the ground did not change. Hikers still vanished, campers still left behind them, tie tents, and the hollow remained as inaccessible as ever, its mist as thick, its silence as unbroken. The digital age had given the hollow new life as folklore, but within its borders, the hunger that defined it went on unbothered, patient as stone, feeding in shadows while the world above argued endlessly over whether it was myth or truth. The 2000s thrust Hollingsworth Hollow into the glare of a new kind of spotlight, as the era of viral videos, handheld camcorders, and the growing fascination with found footage horror transformed what had once been whispered lore into the perfect canvas for digital age thrill seekers. Amateur documentarians lugged shaky cameras into the Appalachians, inspired by the success of films like The Blair Witch Project, convinced they could capture something eerie in the fog and turn it into internet fame. Some of those tapes resurfaced online, pixelated clips showing half-lit cabins, strange chanting in the distance, or the sound of footsteps cutting off abruptly. Others, however, were never posted at all, their creators vanishing into the same silence that had claimed generations before them. Message boards lit up with speculation, debating which videos were staged and which bore the stamp of something far darker, and certain grainy stills. A pale figure at the tree line, a shadow behind a barn door, were passed around endlessly as proof of the hollow's curse. Meanwhile, television producers, hungry for paranormal content, aired episodes of ghost-hunting shows that treated the hollow as another mystery spot, their hosts stumbling theatrically through fog before retreating with nothing more than goosebumps and muffled audio. Yet beneath all the spectacle, The disappearances continued, quiet and untelevised. A pair of film students whose rental car was found abandoned, DV tapes inside spooled to static. A hiker whose final blog entry mentioned hearing laughter in the woods. A drifter whose name appeared briefly in missing persons databases before being deleted for lack of evidence. Technology had spread the Hollow's legend across the globe, but it had not changed the truth inside it. The Sinclairs endured as they always had, smiling at strangers, offering kindness with teeth behind it, their rituals unbroken and their hunger timeless. The more the outside world watched, the less it seemed able to touch them, as if the Hollow itself twisted around cameras and microphones, turning evidence into myth, leaving only fragments, rumors, and an ever-thickening digital archive of fear. The 2010s saw Hollingsworth Hollow ascend from regional legend and internet oddity into a full-fledged phenomenon of digital folklore, woven into the endless churn of social media feeds, creepypasta threads, and binge-worthy true crime podcasts that turned old mysteries into addictive entertainment. Reddit forums hosted sprawling investigations, with users trading satellite images of the Appalachians, theorizing over patterns of disappearances, and insisting that blurry Google Street View captures revealed cabins hidden in the mist. YouTube channels dedicated entire series to the Sinclair curse, piecing together old clippings, grainy VHS snippets, and whispered interviews with locals into ominous timelines that blurred fact and fabrication. Podcasts with millions of listeners dissected every missing hiker case within 100 miles, their hosts speculating whether the Hollow was the work of a cult, a feral bloodline, or something supernatural, their voices tinged with equal parts skepticism and glee. On Twitter and Tumblr, the Hollow became a kind of shared campfire. Artists sketched haunting portraits of the Sinclair family, poets wrote verses about the fog that swallowed footsteps, and urban explorers promised live streams from the Hollow that always ended with static or sudden silence. Yet behind the memes, hashtags, and stylized horror, real people continued to vanish. A group of backpackers, whose Instagram accounts ended abruptly with a final photo of mist-shrouded trees, a solo podcaster who traveled to Appalachia to record the definitive Hollow investigation and never uploaded again, her last text to a friend reading, "Only they're smiling at me," and a drone enthusiast whose footage showed a figure waving from a clearing before the camera tumbled violently to the ground. These incidents fueled the legend further, ensuring the Hollow thrived not just in shadow, but in timelines, threads, and playlists, yet still untouchable, as if the very act of recording only deepened its myth. To the outside world, the Sinclairs became a mixture of horror trope, internet joke, and unresolved mystery. But within the Hollow, nothing changed. The family remained as they had always been, lantern-lit and patient, feeding on strangers who mistook fascination for safety, watching with the same knowing smiles as the world made them famous without ever truly finding them. The 2020s dragged Hollingsworth Hollow into an era of instant virality, where TikTok explorers, YouTube daredevils, and livestream thrill-seekers transformed the legend into a trending challenge, turning the Hollow into a spectacle for millions of curious onlookers who could scroll through terror with the swipe of a thumb. Young influencers posted shaky clips of themselves driving down forgotten roads until the trees closed in, boasting they would spend a night in the Hollow to prove it was just a story, their ring lights casting pale halos in the fog before streams abruptly ended in glitching static or an oddly timed signal-lost screen. Hashtags like #HolloChallenge and #Sinclair Smile surged in popularity, mixing prank videos with unsettling uploads that viewers swore carried sounds of distant laughter, whispering voices, or figures lingering in the mist behind the oblivious hosts. Urban legends merged seamlessly with digital culture, short-form videos claiming to reveal Sinclair recipes, ARG-style puzzles with coordinates leading to nowhere, podcasts dissecting every disappearance with polished sound design, and grainy live streams that ended with nothing but the eerie image of a lantern swaying in the distance. But beneath the noise of filters, hashtags, and performative fear, the Hollow's appetite did not wane. Real vanishings cut through the spectacle with chilling clarity. A TikTok couple who promised to spend 24 hours in the Hollow never posted again. Their abandoned car found with the engine still running. A livestream gamer's final words, muttered nervously to his chat, were, "Someone's smiling at me, they're right outside the car," before his phone dropped to black, and drones sent into the fog streamed footage of indistinct figures waving, always smiling, before abruptly crashing. Some online claimed the Hollow itself was reacting, that the sudden spree of attention had woken something deeper, its mist rolling closer to towns, its pull stronger than ever, as if hunger could grow fat on fascination. Yet, just as in centuries past, no police report, no search team, no digital investigator uncovered anything solid, only fragments, static, and the chilling reminder that the Hollow had outlived every medium that tried to expose it. From whispered tales to viral feeds, patient as ever, watching through smiling mouths as a restless world made its horror immortal. And so, as the present folds into the uncertain future, Hollingsworth Hollow remains what it has always been, a patient wound in the earth, feeding on whoever dares to trespass, impervious to time, technology, or the endless human need to explain away what terrifies us. It has survived every century, cloaked in different names: Witch's Den, Cannibal's Lair, Cursed Valley, Haunted Woods, Viral Hotspot. Yet beneath each costume the truth has not changed, for the Sinclairs endure, smiling through generations, their rituals etched into the marrow of the Hollow itself. The world outside has shifted endlessly, birthing revolutions, wars, radios, televisions, the internet, and now the ceaseless flood of digital attention, but the Hollow has never needed to adapt. Instead, it lets the world bend toward it, reshaping its legend to fit each age while keeping its hunger constant and unbroken. Each telling, whether carved into gossip in a mountain tavern or whispered through a podcast mic to millions, only tightens its grip, spreading the Hollow's shadow into places it has never physically reached, until even those who have never stepped foot in Appalachia find themselves dreaming of its fog, of its silence, of its ever-smiling watchers. Perhaps that is its truest power. Not the bodies it claims, but the way it seeps into imagination itself, ensuring that, even when the last Sinclair is gone, the Hollow will not die, because it has already made itself immortal in story. And story is harder to kill than flesh. If tomorrow's technologies summon new ways to capture fear, neural feeds, immersive simulations, or something not yet named, the Hollow will follow, wearing each medium like another mask, never fading, never ending, only waiting. And perhaps, long after cities crumble and the noise of civilization is silenced, when only forests and ruins remain, the Hollow will still stand. Fog curling like smoke over its trees, smiling figures waiting at its borders, ready to greet the next wanderer who believes the story has finally finished, unaware that in the Hollow, the story is the trap, and it has no end. Even now, as the centuries that cradle Hollingsworth Hollow stretch unbroken into the present, its story persists not as something to be solved or contained, but as a living shadow woven through history, folklore, and memory, each retelling carrying fragments of the truth while feeding the legend itself, for the Hollow has never needed to prove its existence. The steady toll of vanishings, the whispered testimonies of survivors too shaken to speak plainly, and the quiet, almost mocking patience of the Sinclairs have always been evidence enough, and while the world outside hurries forward with brighter screens and louder voices, inside the fog-wrapped ridges the same rituals endure unchanged, lanterns burning against the night, teeth flashing behind gentle smiles, a hunger unbound by time. Outsiders have long mistaken the Hollow as a place that could be conquered by maps, cameras, or algorithms, but each age that tries to expose it only tightens its grip, as though the hollow drinks from curiosity itself, reshaping its myth to fit whatever tools humanity has at hand. From the Salem whispers of witchcraft to the radio static of the 1930s, from the tabloid cult panics of the 1980s to the looping TikToks of today, yet always leaving behind the same outcome: absence, silence, and the sickening certainty that something human, or something wearing humanity like a mask, is still there in the mist, watching, smiling, waiting. In this way, the hollow has become more than a place. It is an inheritance of fear, a wound passed down through generations, surviving not in old bones or rotting cabins, but in imagination itself, thriving because it has learned that stories never die, that so long as one more person dares to whisper its name, its hunger will be fed, and its presence will spread like fog through minds and timelines alike, until one can no longer tell if the hollow exists in Appalachia, or in the dark corner of every thought that wonders what might be standing just outside the circle of firelight, smiling in the dark. And if one dares to step back and see the hollow, not in fragments of folklore or in neatly divided centuries, but as a single, unbroken current that has flowed since the first settler stumbled into its mists, it becomes clear that what endures is not merely a family, nor even a place, but a design older and crueler than human memory, a design that feeds on the intersection of curiosity and fear, drawing strangers toward it the way flame draws moths, promising revelation yet delivering only disappearance, leaving behind the hollowed silence that has marked every era. For in the 1700s it was branded witchcraft, in the 1800s madness, in the 1900s cult hysteria, in the 2000s urban legend, and now in the 2020s a viral spectacle. But at its root, the hollow has remained unchanged, a gnawing hunger wrapped in fog, smiling through borrowed faces, bending each age to carry its name further, ensuring that with every telling, every podcast, every half-believed post, it spreads beyond its ridges, carving itself into human imagination so deeply that even those who never step foot near Appalachia carry it unknowingly in their thoughts. And if this is true, then perhaps the hollow's greatest triumph is not in the lives it swallows, but in the way it has taught the world to retell its story endlessly, ensuring that it will exist as long as there are voices to whisper and ears to listen, until the day comes when no one remembers who the Sinclairs were, what cabin stood, or where the valley lies. But still the fear will persist, faceless yet familiar, smiling in the dark, proving that the hollow was never meant to be found on any map, because the hollow has already taken root in us. And if you are reading these words now, tracing the path of the hollow across centuries as if a story could be contained on a page, then you have already stepped too close, for the hollow does not need your body to claim you. It begins with your attention, your willingness to imagine its fog, its trees, its endless smiling mouths, and once the image forms in your mind, it will wait there, patient and quiet, growing like mold in the dark, feeding on the small unease that lingers when you are alone, when the room grows still, when the night air feels heavier than it should. This is how the hollow travels, not only by footsteps through the mountains, but by memory and imagination, by every retelling that keeps its hunger alive. And so, while you may believe you are safe behind a screen or a book or a story told for entertainment, understand that the hollow has always known how to move beyond its borders, that its oldest ritual is survival through remembrance, and now you remember, which means it remembers you, and somewhere, far from your sight but not beyond its reach, the lanterns are already lit, the fog is already curling, and someone is already smiling, waiting for the day when your path, by choice or by chance, brings you to its edge, where all stories end the same way, in silence, because the hollow does not end with silence, not truly, for even in the stillness after a disappearance, when the forest reclaims footprints and the fog swallows the last echo of a voice, the story continues, reshaping itself in the minds of those who remain, who wonder, who fear, who cannot stop retelling what they have heard, and this retelling is how the hollow ensures it is never forgotten. It is a parasite of memory, a contagion that clings to every whispered warning, every archived news clipping, every grainy photograph and unfinished recording. And the more it is shared, the more it spreads, until its presence is not bound by geography, but woven into thought itself, hiding in the moment someone thinks they see a figure in the periphery, or hears laughter too faint to belong to anyone present, or catches a reflection in the glass that smiles when they do not. And though you may dismiss this as imagination, as the residue of a story too long and too heavy to shake free from your mind, know that imagination is the hollow's chosen weapon, the bridge it uses to step from its ridges into your world, and once it is there, once you have let it in, it will not need the mountains or the fog or even the Sinclairs, because it has already rooted itself in the place you cannot escape, inside you, where no silence can drive it out. And perhaps you've already noticed the way it lingers, the way certain phrases repeat in your head after you stop reading, as though the hollow itself is rehearsing through you, whispering back pieces of its own name, reminding you that this is not just a tale, but an invitation, subtle at first, no louder than the creak of a floorboard when you are alone, or the faint tug of unease when you glance at a window and half expect to see someone watching, smiling. For that is how it begins, not with a sudden terror, but with a slow intrusion, the kind you dismiss as imagination until imagination proves stronger than denial, until the story becomes a shadow following you into sleep, where the dream always ends the same way. Fog thick around you, lantern light flickering in the trees, and a figure standing just out of reach, grinning as if it has been waiting. And when you wake, heart pounding, you will remind yourself it was only a dream, though somewhere deep inside you will know the truth, that the hollow has no borders anymore, that the moment you let its words pass through your eyes, it found its opening, and it will wait, endlessly patient, until the line between story and memory, between fear and reality, thins enough for you to step across without even realizing you've gone, because that is the secret the hollow has always kept, that it does not need to drag you into its woods to claim you. It only needs you to carry it, to think of it, to replay its name when the room is quiet and your thoughts wander toward shadows, and in doing so, you become another vessel, another branch of its story, spreading outward, passing from tongue to ear, from word to mind, until the hollow itself becomes unbound from place and time, a presence woven into the fabric of those who believe and those who don't. Because disbelief is still attention, still energy, still a tether. And so, whether you laugh at it, doubt it, or fear it, the result is the same. It has you. It lingers behind your reflection when you glance too quickly at the mirror. It waits in the space between waking and sleep when you feel the air heavy against your chest. It watches from the edges of photographs where no one should be, always smiling, because the hollow does not need you to believe. It only needs you to remember, and now you do, which means the hollow is already closer than you think, and that is why there is no escape, no final chapter, no closing of the book, because the hollow has already seeped into you the moment your eyes traced its words, the moment its fog uncoiled in your imagination, the moment you pictured the smiling figures in the dark, even if only for a heartbeat, and by picturing them, you gave them shape, gave them passage, gave them the smallest doorway they needed to step closer. For the hollow does not hunt in haste. It waits, it lingers, it grows in silence, until one night when the wind shifts strangely outside your window, or the stillness of a room feels heavier than it should, you will remember this story without wanting to, and the remembering will be enough to make you glance toward the corner, to feel the air press colder against your skin, to sense, before you dare to look, that something is already there, smiling. Because even if you close this now, even if you tell yourself that words cannot harm you, that stories cannot linger once the screen goes dark, the hollow will not vanish with your dismissal, for it has never depended on belief, only on recollection, and memory cannot be unmade. It will wait within you like a splinter beneath the skin, unnoticed until it festers, until the smallest moment of quiet draws it to the surface. A flicker of movement in the periphery, a laugh that seems to echo where no one stands, a smile you catch in the glass that doesn't quite belong to your own reflection. And each time it happens, no matter how quickly you look away, the hollow grows more certain of its place in you, more certain that when the time comes, when you are weakest or most unguarded, it will step fully into your world, and you will understand what all the others before you discovered too late. The hollow was never a story about them. It was always a story about you. And so the ritual completes itself not in fire or blood or the ancient ceremonies of the Sinclairs, but in the simple act of your eyes crossing these words. For every reader becomes a witness, and every witness becomes a keeper, carrying the hollow forward into the next hour, the next conversation, the next restless dream, ensuring that it cannot die because it is not bound to earth or bone, but to thought itself, a contagion of memory that spreads the moment it is recalled. You will tell yourself that you can forget it, that you can bury the image of the fog and the smile. But forgetting is impossible once the seed has been planted, and so you will carry it with you, quietly at first, until one night you mention it to someone else, half joking perhaps or dismissive. And in that instant you pass it on, the hollow flickering into their mind as it did into yours, widening its reach, strengthening its hold, ensuring that the story is never contained but always growing, always circling back, a loop without end. Until one day you realize with a chill that the hollow has never been waiting for you to find it at all, because it has already found you. And that is why no ending can sever it, no final word can shut it away, because the hollow was never meant to be read like a story with a last page. It was meant to uncoil slowly, to breathe inside you, to stretch its roots through your memory until every quiet pause, every glance over your shoulder, every whisper of movement in the dark feels colored by its presence, and whether you resist it or invite it makes no difference, because the act of carrying it has already marked you, set you apart, tied you into the same chain of voices and vanishings that began centuries ago. And while you may still believe you are the reader, safe outside its reach, the truth is simpler and far more merciless. The hollow does not exist in these words. It exists in you now, and it will remain long after the light of this page fades. Because the hollow never allows a story to finish, it only allows it to deepen, to coil tighter, to echo louder inside the minds it touches, and now that it has brushed against yours, it will not retreat but linger, feeding on every thought you give it, no matter how fleeting, turning your imagination into its vessel, your silence into its soil. And as the days pass, you will find it weaving itself into the fabric of your ordinary life, an unease in empty hallways, a hesitation before turning out the light, a shape you're certain you saw but cannot prove was there. And in each of these moments, the hollow will be smiling, for it thrives not on screams, but on the quiet dread that grows in you piece by piece, until one night you will realize that it no longer needs to be remembered at all, because it has already become part of you, inseparable, eternal. And that is the true curse, not to vanish into the fog, but to carry the fog within. And if you doubt this, if you tell yourself that words cannot take root, that stories cannot alter the shape of your nights, then listen closely the next time the house is still, when the clock ticks a little louder than it should, and the dark corners of your room seem deeper than you remember, for it is then you will notice the first signs, the weight in the air as though something unseen is breathing with you, the faint impression of eyes where no one stands, the echo of a grin behind the glass when you catch your reflection too quickly, and in that instant you will understand that the hollow does not need belief to thrive. It only needs the pause, the hesitation, the smallest sliver of your attention, and once it has that, it never lets go, for it is patient, older than stone, older than the names of the ridges themselves, and it will sit quietly inside you, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you it has always been there, smiling, closer than your next breath. And you may try to shake it off, to laugh at the unease as nothing more than suggestion, but the hollow is clever in how it binds itself to you, never striking all at once, never revealing its full shape, only leaning closer through the subtleties you cannot quite dismiss. The way your skin prickles, though the air is still. The way you hesitate before stepping into a darkened room. The way you find yourself replaying these very words when you had no reason to think of them. And with each repetition it tightens its hold, slipping deeper into the folds of your memory, so that even when you forget the details of this story, you will not forget the feeling it left you with, that faint but unshakable sense of being watched, of being chosen. And in time, you will see what all who carry the hollow eventually see, that its smile is not waiting in the distance, but already lives inside the silence between your heartbeats, patient, unblinking, eternal.